Let me see if I can. Yeah, okay. So I'm sure you have seen the title of my presentation, Open Educational Practice for Open Research in Student Education and Beyond. I feel a bit humble being here because I'm not a man of science as such, of hard science. That's not my background. I used to like maths at school. I did well with maths at school, but I didn't follow that path of hard science and maths in my studies or in my professional career. But at the same time, I feel that I may be able to throw some insights from a different perspective on the topics of today. And to me, it's very important that we embark upon the redefinition of concepts and practices, because we need to achieve knowledge equity, more knowledge equity in the world, and without removing conceptual cultural barriers that we erect ourselves very often, I don't think we can move forward in the area of openness, which is very important here today. By the way, I have created a Menti, and it has a code. So if you want, you can write things in menti.com, and the code is 71773507. If you could make a note, I'll put it here in the chat. 71773507. Okay. So I'm going to start with a little story. Once upon a time, there was a country called Spain, which is still there, where there were a lot of people fleeing because of the civil war, because of the Franco dictatorship. A big wave of migration and exile took place for political, economic reasons. And many of these people went to France, Mexico, but some of them, small number, but some of them came here to Britain. One academic in the University of Southampton, Alicia Pozo Gutierrez, decided to study this phenomenon and look for people who have left Spain during the end of the 1930s, 1940s, even 1950s, and carry out a research project with oral history methodology, in which she would interview people about their life experience of migration. And that became the data, a different type of data that we associate with data science when we think about data science, that became the data for her research. And there's a book called Tales of Return, The Memories of and Experiences of Spanish Returnee Migrants from France and Great Britain. So what happened was that these were in tapes. This data was in tapes. It was the tapes were in a drawer, and Alicia was sharing office with some colleagues of mine from Southampton who had been involved in a project called the Homebox, a repository of open educational resources. And we had contributed from an academic perspective, educational perspective, to that repository. And these colleagues of Alicia told her, look, why don't you give use to this data? Well, I need to contact the people, because they contacted the people who were interviewed, and they sought consent, and they decided to apply for a grant to JISC to do a project of oral history and open education resources, whereby those interviews would be digitized, published with Creative Commons licensed, and given use. It was about giving use to that data with an educational purpose, because the data was there in a drawer and it had helped the researcher to write the book, but wasn't being given you know, the necessary honors that we thought those life stories deserved. So we got the grant. They included me in the bid, and we did it with colleagues in Southampton, myself in Leeds and Portsmouth, and that was a starting point of a module that I started to teach in 2012, and then I still teach. So we took the interviews, we digitized the life stories. We were happy with this having a research dimension as well. Of course, it was about disseminating the data, the primary resources. But my main duty within the project was to give provide educational applications for people in a wide variety of disciplines, social sciences, arts and humanities, etc., to those interviews. So one of my outputs was to design a module in which students would work with these digitized interviews under the principles of open education resources. So that was the Open Lives module, which was a module that is not running anymore because it has become something else. But in that module, students would interview Spanish migrants, contemporary, current Spanish migrants, young people generally, who had arrived in Leeds in the previous years from 2008, 2009, because of the economic and financial crisis in Spain and in the majority of the world. They had come here looking for work, trying to escape a difficult economic situation for many people. So the students would interview people, right? But they would have also to use the interviews, all the interviews that were in the repository, in their research, in their work, in order to build a final product that was a podcast. So in this podcast, called digital documentary at the time, because the word podcast wasn't still that popular, students would create their own narrative based on their research and intertwine extracts from the new interviews that they had undertaken and the old interviews. And obviously, before undertaking the interviews, students would learn about research methods and oral history, learn about migration, ethical protocols. They would have to have a plan for research. So it wasn't journalistic. It wasn't like, hey, here's the microphone. What do you think? And so we created, and obviously they would have to learn how to interpret that data, what to make the most of that data, how to go through the interpretation of the interviews, trying to gather concepts, combing the interviews, and learn about the process of production of podcast. So many students actually ended up publishing their podcast in the form of so-called digital documentaries, and they also published the interviews. So in a way, we were contributing with fresh data to the Humboldt repository. And these repository new outputs, the documentaries and the new interviews, would contribute to the creation of a virtuous circle of open knowledge. And at this point, 2012, 2013, the module was only 20 credits, and that's 1/6 of the value of an undergraduate credit waiting. For those of you who are not familiar with the system, is 1/6 of your final year. But then in 2017, that module became a final year project module. So instead of being 20 credits, it became a 40 credit module. It became a module for, it was one of the options for final year projects alongside dissertations and translations. It was open to all the students, regardless of their interests, regardless of the language they were studying or the subject. It was for the whole of the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies. So we had interviews in all languages. Obviously, students were allowed to use other languages if they could do it in English if they wanted. I ended up developing, obviously, because of the experience of the previous module, better resources to train them in research methods, research ethics, podcasting. And it's still a final year project option for us. And it's taught slightly in a different way because when I was the module coordinator of the Open Lives module in Spanish, I was writing the theme tune and singing the theme tune. It was a one-man module, but now I had to encompass a lot of expertise from different people. So I run, as a coordinator of the module, I run the sessions on podcasting, the genre of podcasting, research methods, open education resources, digital humanities, etc. But each student is allocated a supervisor who is an expert on the topic that they are working with. So we have documentaries or podcasts about so many topics because we are an area studies school. So that means that we study many things that happen in the different countries whose languages we cover. Yeah, environmental attitudes in France, migration from Morocco, linguistic discrimination in Ecuador. You know, we have so many different topics. And this is the literature that has been published so far. Well, this is a sample, there are more things, but all these studies that I did, all this, let's say, scholarship, yeah, they were all under the paradigm of open education resources philosophy and critical pedagogy. For me, that is a key idea, critical pedagogy. But today I'm not concentrating on that aspect. What I want to discuss is how, what can we learn in terms of open education, open research, and I will introduce a bit relating to artificial intelligence here from the perspective of the user, of course. Well, what's the connection of all this story with what you are doing today here? So this project, Open Lives, was about digitization of non-digitally produced data. It was not numerical, but it's a different type of data. It was based on values of openness. The philosophy of a student as producer is also important here, initiated by Mike Neary from the University of Lincoln and previously Warwick. Mike Neary introduced the student as a producer philosophy to include students in knowledge production processes at the level of the institution, reinforcing their membership as part of the academic community as a reaction to things like the marketization of higher education. Also interesting things in this, if you think about it, before these terms, reproducibility and replicability of research, were being used as much as they are now, we were in a way introducing elements of reproducibility because we had different student researchers who were able to use the same data, the oral history interviews, for new projects. So the data was reproducible, but also there was an element of replicability because we had similar research designs, the module with the podcast, for which new data could be incorporated as well. And students were required to analyze those texts, reflect upon them, but they also only used human intelligence, not artificial intelligence. So what do I learn from this experience? Going back to the idea of redefining concepts, redefining our understanding of research, of education, and the role that education in research and for research plays. Well, first of all, I like to dispute openly, at least from a conceptual linguistic point, our concept of research. Even, you know, if you look at the definition of the ref of research of the ref, you may end up agreeing with me. For the purpose of the ref, research is defined as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. My interpretation of that is that one thing is the process and another one is the output. When people talk about this is research, well, the activity is research. The output, when we share the insights that are the products of research, in other words, when we write a paper for our peers or for a wider audience based on our activity of research, is that not actually an educational act? Is that not an act of education? The research is the search, the seeking, the investigation, but the output is an act of education. And I know this is controversial. So I'll explain why I believe that. We need to have a wider understanding of what education means. Whenever there is a conscious and constructive engagement with the learning of others, we are educating. And obviously we need to look at education from a wider angle, because education is not just student education as being part of a degree, the formal learning. There is also informal learning and non-formal learning. So whenever we communicate, for instance, now, you may think that this is a research presentation. I conceive this as an act of education because I like to think that I am helping you to learn something that you didn't know before. If I give a presentation of a very specialized topic on a research paper with a research paper to a very small group of people who are very specialized in the subject, we don't think of that as an act of education, but it is an act of education. So it obviously is the importance of intention. And the question of what happens with data, because we may say that Alicia, the person who wrote that book, although she was thinking about research and the ref and sharing that with experts, we could also say easily that that was an act of education. But what about the data? Think about all the data that is generated with research projects. I came up with another concept, which is the OREP, open resources with educational potential. Why? Because we produce a lot of data with the purpose of using it to support what we are going to explain in our papers. But we don't think about that data usually as something that could be used for education. So there is a sort of threshold there that we need to consider as well. And then I also came up with the word educalize. Educalize, you can Google it. There's some people who have used educalize before, but not much and not for this purpose. So I came up with the idea of educalize based on all these experiences. What we were doing with that research data was to educalize it. Why? Because it had been produced with a non-educational purpose in mind, but we thought that it could be given an educational value. So what is to educalize? Is to search and discover the potential educational value of knowledge that has not been perhaps produced originally with an educational aim. And it could cover anything. It could cover research data, but it could cover news items. It could cover art. And educalize is also to describe the educational affordances of such knowledge, codified knowledge, attribute relevance, adapt for educational use. And then the last lesson. I think it was very important for me, resulting from this experience, that we need to conceive research, the activity itself, also as a form of learning for ourselves and for everybody involved in the research, especially when it comes to participatory research. Yeah, it is a learning process for all of us. And as I said, if there is learning and there is awareness of the learning and support of the learning, we are engaging in education in one way or another. Learning to research is also very important. I realize that one thing is looking for data in the library, in the books, in the internet. And another one is talking to people, research openly. If research needs to be more open in society or to society, we need to start at undergraduate level. And also, I remember that it was very easy for me to help students to recruit participants because I am Spanish, I live in Leeds, and I know people. So it was very easy for me to advise students how to find research participants for these documentaries. When the module changed and there were different students doing interviews for people from completely different backgrounds to the ones I knew about, and people in subjects, supervisors working with subjects that were not familiar with my subjects, then I realized that if you want openness in research, you need to cultivate connections with other people outside academia. It's not good with saying, I'm a professor of French. I want my students, my students are going to interview you, or openness in research requires connections, require contacts, requires a presence within society as a researcher, but also a permanent conversation with the people you want to involve in your research, either as participants or as beneficiaries of it. I'm going to do a little pause to see if there are any questions on the how many students each year studied, am I sharing yet? How many students each year studied the 20 credit module, and now how many students do the project module? This is scale up to 400 students, of course not. I wish. The 20 credit module, we managed to have 15 students one year. This year for the about 400 students of the school who do final year project, or 300, I would say, 300, 400, we have about 28. It is still a minority option, although it has grown. So redefining open education with artificial intelligence. How am I doing for time? 9:51. When do I have to finish, Eric and Noram?
I think you're fine.
Okay.
We are enjoying your talk. Carry on, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well,
finish by 10:10.
Okay, because I have been experimenting with artificial intelligence this Christmas. When everybody was resting in the morning, I woke up early or was with my phone in bed, chatting with open artificial intelligence, the GPT chat box. And I was wondering what would happen with this module and with these activities in which students have to interpret the text of the interviews that they have produced, or the interviews of others. So I decided to put a number of questions to the chat, and I use this as an example, as the work. As I said, this is not proper research in the sense that it is more myself as a user of the software, of the Open AI chat box, putting myself in the position of a student trying to do some of this work in interpreting the resources. Okay, so this is one of the slides that I use in my presentations when I talk about the importance of oral history methodologies, and I ask students about the educational value, philosophical, humanistic value of these interviews, of these testimonies. And this is an extract from one of the people who was interviewed in the first round of interviews. He's called Germinal Luis. When he was interviewed, he was in the late 70s, and he has an amazing, interesting life, very sad as well in many ways, because he was forced to flee Spain because his dad was a political activist prosecuted by the Franco regime. The family was going through a very bad time during the Spanish Civil War. His dad was being prosecuted. His family was being harassed. It wasn't a safe environment for him. So his mother in Barcelona in 1937, I think it was, decided to put him with a with one of his cousins, a girl a bit older than him. He was 7 or 8, and the girl was probably 13, 14, I can't remember. And they went to France, to a village where they knew somebody who they had written a letter to and say, we are sending the boy and the girl there, and they put them on a train. And they got there to this village, and then the sister and the brother split, and he was by himself as a child refugee in France. And then the Second World War started. The Nazis occupied occupied France. His dad, who had escaped to France, was now being prosecuted by the Nazi army, and he was by himself in France, just living as a child refugee, but unofficially refugee, of course, because there wasn't a network of support. So he talks about this episode. I mean, the interview is very long; it's about 3 hours. So can you all read it properly? Yeah, is it readable? I'm going to read it out, but yeah. So he talks about when his brother was born, and then 10 years old. And he talks about when he was 10 years old and spent a lot of time with a group of troublemakers doing whatever they wanted around Marseille in France. Yeah. So he talks about them as troublemakers. And he says, the eldest was Claudio, who was 14. I will remember him in my life because he was a gangster. Spanish children. We started to steal food from the port of Marseille. The boats from Algeria were our favorites because they brought oranges and dates. Every now and again, as the boats were being unloaded, a wooden crate would fall to the floor and break, and dates would go everywhere. The floor of the port was covered in grease and dust. The street cleaners would come to sweep the floor, and there would be mountains of dirt. The children were like tigers lying in wait for a box to fall. Imagine the situation. And then he says, I thought about this later, and then he starts to cry. These men were dropping the boxes on purpose. I get emotional with this. There was no reason why those boxes would fall on the floor. So this is a testimony that I put to students to analyze and think about educational value, also the narrative value, the value of narrative as a way of constructing your own past, etc. There are many epistemological things here that we work. So I went to artificial intelligence and I said, I'm going to ask a question. Sorry, this is the same text, yeah? So I asked the artificial intelligence chat box the following. I gave a lot of context in this chat, in particular in this thread. So I explained, Germinal Luis, a man in his 80s, tells the story of his life in an oral history interview to a researcher. Germinal spent a good part of his childhood since the age of 7, wandering through France as a child refugee, fleeing from the Spanish Civil War. His father was a political activist prosecuted by Franco. In 1939, the Second World War starts. So after the invasion of France by the Nazi army, his father becomes also a victim of persecution of the Nazis in that country. In that context, being with no family, Germinal arrives in Marseille, France, where he struggles with other refugee children. Below, you can find a passage of one of his experiences in Marseille. I would like to ask you, dear artificial intelligence chat box, what do you think of this passage? How you interpret it? What value it has, scientific, educational, and or humanistic? In this passage, Germinal talks about something that happened to him when he was 10 years old, when he used to spend a lot of time with a group of children that he ironically refers as troublemakers, blah, blah, blah. So as you see, all this context is important, yeah? Because I asked that, and this is the answer. It was amazing. It seems that Jeremy, first of all, is very descriptive. Yeah, it tells you what it has read. It explains what it is. But then it starts to get into an assessment of the situation and discovering interesting things about the passage, interesting interpretations. So it says here at the bottom, On the left, Germinal becomes emotional when thinking about his memory, perhaps because it brings up difficult feelings of hunger and desperation. And then on the right, this passage has both humanistic and educational value. From a humanistic perspective, it provides insight into the experiences of a child refugee during a time of war and political turmoil. It recognizes, it mentions the war and the political turmoil. This is important, yeah, that you remember this, yeah. It also highlights the resourcefulness and resilience of these children as they found ways to survive despite facing difficult circumstances. From an educational standpoint, this passage could be used to teach about the history of the Spanish Civil War. Obviously, I had mentioned the Spanish Civil War and the impact it had on people's lives, as well as the experience of the refugees and the challenges they face. It could also be used to encourage, very important to me at least, empathy and understanding for those who have had to cope with that adversity. Brilliant, yeah? But then I thought, hang on a second. I will ask the same question in another thread, because you need to use a different thread for this. And I simply asked, with less context, this. Can you analyze this passage, interpret it, and define what value has scientific education and or humanistic? Yeah, so that is the value that I ask for. And I do a small contextualization. I mentioned 1942, yeah, but I don't mention much more, yeah. It's a short, let's see what he answers. The answer is completely different. This passage describes a situation in which a group of children, so it explains the passage. Then the narrator reflects on this experience and becomes emotional. Good. Suggesting that the men unloading the crates may have intentionally dropped them. Yeah. So he's less certain about, the intentionality of the men. Yeah. He's just suggesting that the men unloading the crates may have. And then he says, it is possible to interpret this passage as having scientific value because it describes a past event. I mean, that's valuable, but it may also have educational value in that it provides insight into the lives of children living in Marseille during a specific time. It doesn't say the war or never mind the Spanish Civil War or anything. From a humanistic perspective, the passage may be seen as having value in that it conveys the emotional impact of the experience on the narrator and the sense of camaraderie among the group of children. So very different in the reach, very different answer. And then I decided to prompt it. I said, but what do you make out of the fact that the boxes, according to Germinal, were not falling accidentally? And it becomes, a bit shirty even, because it even says alternative could be that Germinal recollections of the event is not entirely accurate, which, in the previous answer, he was fine accepting, more or less that was true. But here it was like defensive. It may not have happened. Without more information, it is difficult to definitely say what the cause of the boxes falling was. And then I decided to actually, be a bit more critical. And I said to him, you seem unperturbed by the lack of professionality of the men. They are effectively in breach of their employment contracts by giving away food that they are supposed to transport and does not belong to them, And he said that he apologized. He said that it is certainly possible that these men were breaching their employment contracts, but it was important to consider the context in which this behavior took place. This may have been motivated by compassion and desire to help these children. It can be seen as an example of generosity and kindness. And this prompting came about in relation to the full answer with the context. Yeah. And then the big moral test came here. and I'm about to finish now. So would you say that today, in the 21st century Britain, it would be considered morally appropriate for delivery staff in supermarkets to drop boxes of food that don't belong to them in the streets of poor neighborhoods in the UK where children, refugees live with insufficient support from the government? So it turns out that that is not appropriate. That instead, in red, instead it is important to work towards finding solutions to address these challenges and support these children and their families in a responsible and ethical manner. So you see that there are clearly implications here in terms of how we contextualize the information, how we provide that context, in what order we ask the information, and certainly the artificial intelligence needs to be understood much better when it comes to asking a lot of things. So when he says here that yeah, for 21st century Britain, this is not adequate, giving away food that is not yours, like the way in which the French workers were doing in 1942 is not appropriate. I said to the intelligence, so it is okay for workers in Marseille's docks and not for supermarket delivery workers in Britain nowadays? And it repeated the answer, yeah, it's not acceptable. This could be a criminal activity. It could be vandalism. We need to find solutions to address these challenges. So it is okay for the artificial intelligence to praise acts of self-generosity, revolutionary generosity in difficult circumstances in one place, but not in another, not in Britain. And then I put that question to the artificial intelligence. Would the delivery workers in Britain not be providing, and I quote you, so using a quote from artificial intelligence, why are you saying that the delivery workers in Britain are not providing an example of generosity and kindness? Those are their words, the words of the intelligence. Are they not motivated by compassion and a desire to help these children? As you mentioned before, don't you think that you are displaying double standards? So the conversation got very interesting. And what I think is that we need to, I'm happy to share the whole conversation. I can put it on a Word document. I have it in a document, a Word document and a PDF. But the chat with the chat box GPT-3 highlighted to me some problems. First of all,
right, Antonio, can I just ask if you want to have opportunity to answer any questions, can you stop in the next 5 minutes? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop in 3 minutes. So problems. Students are going to be using this. It can impact the way students work and how they approach the interpretation of the data from research. The chat box didn't really identify moral dilemmas. It was naturally conservative morally when it came to Britain 21st century. There are explanations for that. It missed the historic contextualization, even though it was given the dates. If you tell her or him that it's 1942, Second World War, Spanish Civil War, then it includes it. But if not, the historical contextualization is missed. You need to prompt topics so that it can elaborate answers, and it promotes the one-to-one interaction only. But there is no artificial emotional intelligence here, because the tone, the register, everything is very much based on what somebody would say academically. Opportunities. We need to show students the difference between simple queries and loaded queries with context. We need to train students to use this for dialogue and exploration. And very important, I think chat box GPT-3 needs to include the possibility of different people asking things as teams. Yeah. There's another thing that I wanted to talk about, but I'll leave it for the questions and answers. And some conclusions here. Education is the backbone of everything we do in higher education, including research. Creating new knowledge is an educational effort always. Research is a learning process for the researcher and for those who participate in the research in any way. And I think the important thing in open education, open research, is the underlying human relationships, the communication that underpins them within our academic community and outside. And finally, openness is contextual. Everybody needs to define openness in the context where they are. There is not one rule fits all. And thank you. I hope we can keep dropping the crates of our knowledge, yeah, through openness, yeah. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of dropping the crates of our knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We have 5 minutes before our next speaker for any questions. I think this is really interesting. Your sort of approach to AI seems to be programming in terms of writing the appropriate input to ChatGPT rather than writing Python code. So you are still, in a sense, AI programming because you're designing the questions which generate these interesting answers. However, do we have any questions or comments from the audience? You had your Mentimeter, actually. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Perhaps you better answer the questions on the Mentimeter, if there are any.
Yeah, I can see here, try Chat GPT free. You can try it, but I can tell you that yesterday it was down because there are too many people using it. I've been told.
Can I just add, if you use the Leeds University VPN, then it thinks you're at Leeds University and lets you use it. I think that I've understand that some people in other parts of the world have been cut off because it, but for some reason it seems to like UK and Leeds University email addresses.
Yeah.
Or if it doesn't work, just keep trying, you'll get back.
Yes, the input, I don't think there is a maximum length of input in a chat from me. I have been asking her, I say her because in Spanish intelligence is feminine, but I've been asking her a lot of questions about a lot of things this Christmas, and I have never been asked, to keep it short, okay? But you're welcome to test it. The important thing for me here, or one of the important things, is how we ensure that students use this in a productive way. How we ensure that they understand the limitations. How we identify bias within artificial intelligence. I find it rather ironic that, what is considered an act of generosity and kindness and rebellious solidarity in France is considered a crime in Britain. Probably, I've been reading about the way in which artificial intelligence needs to be controlled by the people who build it, so that a certain type of messages are not given. So artificial intelligence should never promote criminal activities. So when it came to 21st century, somebody has managed actually to get artificial intelligence chat box to say things that they say they wouldn't dare to say publicly. If you ask the questions in a certain way, it ends up saying things that are morally questionable. And I think when I brought about the 21st century Britain supermarket drivers dropping food for free to children, immediately the question of crime, legal, social order, acceptability came about, and it gave me always consistently the answer about the this could be a crime, this could be vandalism, you could be prosecuted, it's not acceptable whatsoever. Anyway, are there any other questions?
Yeah, and feel free to turn your microphone on and ask the question. You don't have to type into chat. Anybody want to ask anything?
Hello, my name is Fatma Shokran. I'm from Egypt, and I wanted to ask, do you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask, can ChatGPT deal with voice records? Like, does it always have to be written texts like when I try to use it? And if so, if it has to be written, how did you manage to do your data on GPT? If it was like recorded interviews, did you have to have it written in a way or another?
Yeah, at the moment, I don't think it takes that. What I did was to put the script of the of the of the interview. Obviously, he would miss a lot of things. In fact, that's why I had to put in brackets, he gets emotional. In the same way with the outputs of the chat box, I find it that the tone, the register, the style is always the same. So there is no understanding of different contexts. I don't think I can talk with the chat box as if I was talking with somebody on a Saturday afternoon having a drink or having a good time in any way, because it embodies the personality traits in terms of communication, the attitudes of somebody with an authority, almost like an academic authority. That's the interaction that you have with it, and I don't think it perceives tone register from you as well, and that's very important as well. If we move towards voice recognition, can the artificial intelligence detect that I may be talking tongue in cheek, or that I may be being ironic in any way, or that I may be sounding a bit upset, or all the nuances that orality can convey. So that's a big challenge for the authors of this amazing tool, actually. Very interesting.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for
Thank you.
a really interesting insight into ChatGPT and what you can and can't do.